Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission is always to take these complex, often difficult stories, pull apart the evidence, and give you the context you need to really understand what happened and, just as importantly, why it still matters today. Today, we're doing a very meticulous and, frankly, a heartbreaking deep dive, looking at one of the most enduring cold cases in modern American history, the abduction and murder of Jacob Wetterling. This case haunted a community in Minnesota for almost 3 decades, but its impact went so much further. It actually, fundamentally changed child protection laws across the entire United States. So our job here is to navigate this really difficult 27-year timeline. We're going to unpack the details of the crime itself, analyze the investigative failures that let the case go cold for so long, and then pinpoint the breakthroughs that finally led to a confession. And finally, we'll examine the profound legislative legacy that came directly from this tragedy.
It's just a devastating story. The basic facts are, they're very straightforward. Jacob Irwin Wetterling, born in 1978. On October 22, 1989, he was 11 years old. That was the night he was kidnapped and murdered in his hometown of St. Joseph, Minnesota. The search for Jacob became this national story, a national vigil, really, but the person who did it remained a complete mystery for nearly 27 years.
So let's go back to that night, October 22, 1989. It's a Sunday evening, just after 9 o'clock. Jacob, who's 11, is doing something completely normal, something thousands of kids were doing that night. He's biking home with his younger brother Trevor, who was 10, and a friend Aaron Larson, who was also 11. They'd just been to a convenience store to rent a video. I mean, it's the absolute picture of small-town American life.
Total innocence. But that was shattered in an instant. The perpetrator, who we now know as Danny Heinrich, he emerged from a driveway right in their path. He was masked, wearing a stocking cap over his face, and he was carrying a revolver.
And the sources are specific about the weapon, aren't they? There's a detail there that's pretty significant.
They are. The gun was unloaded.
Unloaded. That tells you something, doesn't it? It suggests this wasn't about the act of shooting, but about pure psychological control. The visual threat was everything.
Exactly. It was about creating instant, absolute fear and compliance. And it worked. He immediately ordered all 3 boys to stop, throw their bikes into a ditch, and lie face down on the ground. And this is where you start to see his method, his chilling modus operandi come into play. The way he selected his victim.
How did he do that?
He started by asking each boy his age.
Just cold, methodical.
Very. He started with Trevor, Jacob's 10-year-old brother. He told him to get up, run towards a nearby wooded area, and not look back. And he added a threat. If you look back, I'll shoot you.
My goodness, for a 10-year-old boy, that must have been just paralyzing terror.
Unimaginable. And once Trevor was gone, Heinrich turned to the 2 11-year-olds, Jacob and Aaron. He told them to turn their heads so he could see their faces.
So he's appraising them.
He's appraising them. There's this silent moment, and then he chooses Jacob. He gives Aaron the exact same command he gave Trevor. Run towards the woods, don't look back, or I'll shoot.
And that was it. That was the last time anyone, besides his killer, ever saw Jacob Wetterling alive.
That was the moment.
Right.
The line was crossed.
The reaction in St. Joseph must have been instantaneous.
The town was just completely rocked. A massive search effort kicked off almost immediately. And we're not just talking about the local police.
Right, this went national very quickly.
Very quickly. You had local police, the FBI, even the Minnesota National Guard was deployed. The scale was huge right from the start.
And the community response was just as big. This became a mission for everyone there.
Oh, absolutely. The Friends of Jacob Wetterling Center was formed almost right away. It became a hub for volunteers, for organizing searches, printing flyers, managing the thousands of tips that started flooding in. There was this incredible surge of hope and determination.
But this is where we hit the first and maybe the most painful part of the investigation's failure. Because despite all that energy, all those resources, the case went cold.
It did. And the tragedy within that tragedy is that they actually spoke to the man who did it very early on.
You mean Heinrich was on their radar for the beginning?
He was. Our sources confirmed that Danny Heinrich, who was a local, was questioned by investigators on December 16th, 1989.
That's less than 2 months after the abduction.
Less than 2 months. They even took a DNA sample from him, but he was released.
Yeah.
Lack of sufficient evidence. They couldn't connect him directly to the crime scene. They couldn't break his story. So they had his DNA in a file, but they let him walk out the door.
And that failure, that inability to connect the dots right there in 1989 is what allowed this case to stay unsolved for the next quarter of a century.
It created a black hole that the investigation just fell into for decades.
That is just devastating to think about.
Yeah.
And it really forces you to look at the broader context, because what we know now is that this wasn't some isolated first-time offense. Jacob's abduction was part of a pattern.
That's the critical piece that was missing for so long. To understand this case, you have to talk about Jared Shirel. His case was the key that ultimately unlocked everything.
And that happened before Jacob was taken, right?
Yeah. Yes, about 9 months before. On January 13th, 1989, Jared Shirel was 12 years old at the time. He was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and threatened in Cold Spring, Minnesota.
And how far is Cold Spring from where Jacob was abducted?
That's the thing. It's only about 10 miles away, 16 kilometers. The proximity in both time and geography should have been a massive red flag.
And the method? The modus operandi? Was it similar?
It's chillingly similar, almost a mirror image. Jared's statement confirmed the attacker used a gun, that same tool of intimidation, and then after the assault, when he released him, he gave the exact same command.
Don't look back.
Run and don't look back or I'll shoot you. When you see an identical script like that, used in two towns just 10 miles apart, you're not looking for two different people. You're looking for a serial predator.
But the pattern might go back even further than that from what the sources say. There were other attacks.
There were. Much later, in 2014, investigators finally started to connect a much wider web. They went back and re-examined a series of attempted and actual child molestations in the Paynesville area.
And Paynesville is, what, about 40 minutes from St. Joseph?
About that, yeah. And these attacks happened even earlier. Between the summer of 1986 and the spring of 1987, there were 5 teenage boys attacked in that area during that time. Again, no arrests were ever made.
So for years, these were all seen as separate, isolated incidents.
Exactly. Just tragic but unconnected crimes in different jurisdictions.
And I understand that a big push to connect these Paynesville cases came from outside of law enforcement.
It did, and this is a really important part of the story. A lot of the credit goes to an amateur investigator, a blogger named Joy Baker. She had been digging into these old Paynesville cases for years, convinced they were all connected.
So she brought her research to the authorities.
She did. She was persistent. And her work in consolidating all that information was a major catalyst. It helped convince investigators to finally look at all of these incidents. Paynesville in 86 and 87, Cold Spring in January 89, and St. Joseph in October 89 as the work of one person.
That really shows the power of, a dedicated person asking the right questions, even when the official investigation has stalled.
Absolutely. Without that community-driven effort, those dots might have remained unconnected for even longer.
So by 2014, they finally have this potential timeline, but they still don't have a name. They don't have the forensic link. Let's pivot to that breakthrough, because this is where modern science finally catches up to that mistake made back in 1989.
Right. And it's a testament to why you never, ever throw away old evidence. As we said, they took a DNA sample from Danny Heinrich way back in December of 1989. For 25 years, that sample just sat in an evidence locker. There was nothing to compare it to in the Wetterling case because there was no crime scene, no body, and therefore no DNA from the killer.
But there was DNA from the Jared Shirel case.
There was, and that was the game changer. In 2015, as part of a renewed push, investigators started running old DNA samples against evidence from other unsolved crimes. And they got a hit.
Heinrich's 1989 sample matched the DNA from the Shirel assault.
A perfect match. After 26 years, they had it. The man who assaulted Jared Shirel was Danny Heinrich. And if he did that, he was almost certainly the man who took Jacob Wetterling.
That must have been a huge moment. But it also created a massive legal problem for them, didn't it? They have this proof, but they can't actually charge him with that crime.
Right. And this is a crucial legal point for you to understand. They couldn't prosecute him for the Shirel kidnapping and assault because of the statute of limitations.
The time limit for filing charges had run out.
It had long since expired. For those types of crimes in Minnesota at the time, once that clock runs out, it's over. You can have a videotaped confession and a perfect DNA match, and you still can't file charges.
So they have their man, they know he's a serial predator, but they can't touch him for the one crime they can forensically prove.
It was an enormous tactical challenge. They had the identity, but no leverage. No way to hold him.
So how do they create that leverage? They had to find another way in.
This is where the federal government gets involved. They used federal law to get around the limitations of state law. First, in October 2015, they publicly named Heinrich as a person of interest in the Wetterling case. That put a huge amount of pressure on him.
And then they got a search warrant.
A federal search warrant for his house. And during that search, they found what they needed to make an arrest. They found child sexual abuse material on his computer.
Child pornography.
Yes, and possession of that material is a serious federal crime. And critically, the feds weren't bound by the expired state statute of limitations on the Shiles case.
So that became the tool. The pornography charge wasn't the ultimate goal. It was the mechanism to finally get him off the streets and into a room where they could talk to him.
It was precisely that. On October 28, 2015, they arrested him on 25 federal counts of possession of child pornography, and suddenly the entire dynamic shifted. He wasn't a free man anymore. He was in federal custody, facing a very long time in prison.
And that pressure is what finally led to the truth about Jacob.
That pressure is what broke the case.
Which brings us to the confession, the discovery of Jacob's remains, and a plea deal that, for many people, was a very bitter pill to swallow.
It was an agonizing decision for everyone involved. Heinrich was facing overwhelming evidence on those 25 federal charges. He knew he was going away for a long time. His only move was to make a deal.
Can you walk us through the terms of that plea bargain? Because it was very specific.
It was. Heinrich agreed to cooperate completely. That meant telling them everything that happened to Jacob and, most importantly, leading them to where he had buried the body.
And in exchange?
In exchange, prosecutors agreed to two major concessions. First, he would only have to plead guilty to one of the 25 pornography charges. And second, and this is the most difficult part, they agreed they would not charge him with the murder of Jacob Wetterling.
So they traded a murder prosecution for answers, for the location of Jacob's body. That must have been a source of intense debate.
It was. But you have to look at it from the prosecution's perspective and from the family's. Without a body, getting a murder conviction after 27 years would have been incredibly difficult, maybe impossible. A jury could have acquitted him.
A risk of him walking free.
A huge risk. This deal guaranteed he would be locked up for a long time on the federal charge, and, crucially, it gave the Wetterling family what they'd been waiting 27 years for. Closure. The chance to bring their son home.
And that moment of closure finally came on September 1st, 2016.
On that day, Heinrich held up his end of the bargain. He led investigators out to a pasture near Paynesville, Minnesota.
Paynesville again, near where those earlier attacks happened.
And near where Heinrich was living back in 1989, he took them to a specific spot and they started to dig.
And they found him.
They found Jacob's clothing and they found human remains. 2 days later, on September 3, dental records confirmed the unthinkable. It was Jacob.
I remember his mother, Patty Wetterling's statement. It was so powerful. Jacob has been found and our hearts are broken. That captures the feeling perfectly, doesn't it? Relief and devastation all at once.
The end of a 27-year search. They finally knew.
And the horrible details of what they now knew came out in a court hearing before Judge John Tunheim. Heinrich had to confess, under oath, to everything.
He did. The confession was just horrific. He testified that after he kidnapped Jacob, he handcuffed him, drove him to that gravel pit near Paynesville, and sexually assaulted him. And then, he said, he shot and killed him and buried his body right there.
The sources also mentioned he had a police scanner that night.
That's right. He claimed he was able to avoid the initial police search because he was listening to their radio traffic on a scanner. It shows a level of, criminal sophistication and planning.
And there was another disturbing detail. He went back to the site later.
That might be one of the most chilling parts of his confession. He admitted that he returned to the burial site about a year after the murder to move the body.
Why?
He said he'd noticed that part of Jacob's jacket had become exposed from the ground. He was afraid of being discovered, so he dug up the remains and buried them again, deeper.
Just cold and calculated. And during that same hearing, he also had to formally admit to the Shiles crime, correct?
Yes. As part of the deal, he stood in court and admitted to kidnapping and sexually assaulting Jared Shiles. It officially linked the two cases and confirmed he was the serial predator they had been hunting for decades.
So let's talk about the sentence. He gets 20 years. For many people, that sounds impossibly light for what he did.
It does, on the surface. He received the maximum sentence for that one count of child pornography he pleaded guilty to, 20 years in federal prison. But the key to the deal, the public safety part, is what happens after those 20 years are served.
The civil commitment.
Exactly. The plea deal explicitly allows the state of Minnesota to seek his civil commitment as a sexually dangerous person the moment his federal sentence ends.
And that's not a criminal proceeding. It's different.
It's completely different. It's a civil court process where the state argues that even though he's done his time, he has a mental abnormality that makes him highly likely to reoffend. If the court agrees, they can hold him in a secure state treatment facility, potentially for the rest of his life.
So the plea deal was structured to ensure that, one way or another, he would likely never be released back into the public.
That was the strategy. And Judge Thunheim made that absolutely clear in his sentencing statement. He gave this incredibly powerful speech where he looked past the technical charge.
He didn't want the record to just say child pornography.
No, he said, and I'm quoting here, "We won't pretend that this crime and sentence is about child pornography." He went on to say, "It is also about changing the lives of so many children and parents. Every child knows the story of Jacob Wetterling. You stole the innocence of children in small towns, in the cities of Minnesota and beyond."
He was speaking to the entire generation that grew up under the shadow of this case.
He was, and he looked directly at Heinrich and essentially foreshadowed the civil commitment, saying that because the crime was so heinous, it was unlikely society will ever let you go free, even after the 20 years. He was sending a clear message. Heinrich was then transferred to a federal medical center in 2017 to start serving that sentence.
Before we get to Jacob's incredible legacy, there's one more deeply disturbing part of the story we need to cover: the missed opportunity. The connection to a man named Dwayne Hart.
This is just a gut-wrenching part of the timeline. After Heinrich's arrest, media reports uncovered that he and his brother had been sexually abused when they were children. Their abuser was a man named Dwayne Hart.
And Hart had dated Heinrich's mother. He was a convicted sex offender who deliberately targeted single mothers to get to their children.
A classic predatory pattern. And while that history in no way excuses what Heinrich did, it provides this incredibly dark context. But that's not the most shocking part of the Dwayne Hart connection.
The shocking part is what Hart told the police, and when he told them.
Yes, it's catastrophic. Dwayne Hart implicated Danny Heinrich in the Wetterling disappearance as early as 1991.
1991. 2 years after Jacob was taken. What did he say?
He told investigators two very specific, very explosive things. First, he said that Danny Heinrich had asked him for advice on how to dispose of a body.
Wow.
And second, he said he had seen suspicious items, including firearms, at Heinrich's house.
I mean, that's not a vague tip. That's a named informant giving concrete, actionable intelligence, pointing directly at a person of interest from whom they'd already taken a DNA sample.
It should have been an all-hands-on-deck moment. It should have triggered a massive follow-up.
But it didn't.
For reasons that are still not entirely clear, that lead went cold. Our sources indicate it was apparently not followed up on. Maybe they didn't find Hart credible because of his own criminal record. Maybe it got lost in the shuffle. Whatever the reason, the lead just died.
If they had pursued that in 1991 and connected it back to the fact that they'd already interviewed Heinrich and had his DNA on file,
the case could have been solved 25 years earlier. It's the most tragic what if in this entire story. It highlights a systemic failure that had devastating consequences.
it's truly heartbreaking, which makes what Jacob's family did in the face of that failure and their grief all the more remarkable. Let's shift to that legacy. The laws and organizations created in his name.
The strength of Jacob's parents, Jerry and Patty Wetterling, is almost beyond comprehension. They refused to let their son's memory be defined only by the crime. Just 4 months after he was taken, they formed the Jacob Wetterling Foundation.
And this wasn't just about funding Jacob, was it? It was a broader mission.
It was. It was about child safety for all children. Over the years, that mission became more focused. In 2008, it became the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center with a clear goal: to educate the public about who takes children, how they do it, and what each of us can do to stop it. They work to change the conversation from just stranger danger to a more realistic understanding of prevention and awareness.
And their advocacy had an almost immediate and truly monumental impact on federal law.
It did. In 1994, just a few years after the abduction, Congress passed the Jacob Wetterling Act. This piece of legislation is foundational. It changed everything about how the justice system tracks offenders.
Explain what it did, because before this act, the system was a complete patchwork. Right.
A total mess. Before 1994, there was no uniform system. A convicted sex offender could serve their sentence, move to a different state, and essentially vanish. Law enforcement in their new town would have no idea who they were. The Jacob Wetterling Act was the first federal law that required states to create and maintain a sex offender registry. It was a condition for them to receive certain types of federal law enforcement funding. It forced the creation of a system where there was none.
And that law was just the beginning. It laid the groundwork for other major laws that people are probably more familiar with today.
Absolutely. The Wetterling Act was the first domino. The next big one was Megan's Law in 1996, named for Megan Kenka.
So the Wetterling Act created the registry, the list of names. What did Megan's Law add?
Megan's Law added the public notification component. It said it's not enough for police to have this list. The community has a right to know if a registered offender is moving into their neighborhood. It mandated that states create systems to inform the public.
So now you have registration and notification, and then a decade later, another law built on top of that framework.
Right. The Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006, its goal was to standardize everything. Even with the first two laws, the rules for who had to register, what tier they were, how often they had to check in, it all varied wildly from state to state. The Adam Walsh Act created a national uniform standard for all of these registries and established the National Sex Offender Registry you see online today. So you can draw a direct line from Jacob's abduction in 1989 to this comprehensive national system we have now.
It's an incredible cascade of change. And beyond the laws, there are physical memorials, like the Bridge of Hope.
Yes, a bridge over the Mississippi River near St. Cloud was dedicated to Jacob. It's called the Bridge of Hope, a permanent reminder of hope his family held onto for so many years.
As we bring this all together, we're left with this really painful contrast. On one side, you have this profound institutional failure, a 27-year investigation that missed key leads and failed to connect obvious patterns for decades.
And on the other side, you have this incredibly rapid and effective legislative response. The work of Jacob's parents started changing federal law within 4 years, so the justice system's criminal investigation was agonizingly slow, but the political and social response they inspired was incredibly fast and permanent.
And that contrast really comes down to individual persistence versus institutional inertia. The persistence of the Wetterling family, and even people like Joy Baker, the amateur investigator who helped connect the Paynesville cases.
It's a powerful reminder. In these long, cold cases where the system itself might have failed or moved on, progress often comes from the outside. From the families who won't give up, the community members who remember something, and the new investigators willing to look at old files with fresh eyes.
So if you think about this story, reflect on that idea of persistence versus paralysis. Think about how often true justice, especially in a case like this, depends not just on a big initial response, but on the quiet, unrelenting refusal over decades by a few dedicated people to simply accept that the answers can't be found. That commitment is what finally brought Jacob home and is what ensures his memory continues to protect countless other children today.